Hey everyone, this is Blake. Today I'm going to talk to you about answering T in theory. So, just a quick note up top, answering T in theory is a really complex skill. It's one that takes a little bit to acquire. So, there's no way, no matter how long this video is, that I can cover every little tip and trick and important piece of information necessary to be a good T or theory debater, but this is meant to be a starting point. So take everything here as pretty strong suggestions as opposed to absolute facts. And there's a couple of exceptions to that, things that you should absolutely always do, and I'll talk about those when we get there. But for the most part, this is kind of a loose guide. So first, I want to start by giving a quick review of what the structure of a T or theory shell looks like. It's important that we understand what we're answering before we talk about how we do that. So there are kind of four main parts to a shell. The first part is the interpretation, or the interp. If we're talking about T, topicality, then what that interp is just a definition of the word that's in the topic. That makes sense because if you're trying to prove whether or not your opponent is being topical, we need to understand what the topic means, and the definition lets us understand that. If the shell is a theory shell, then the interp is more like a debate rule than it is a definition. You probably won't be reading anything from Merriam-Webster that talks about concepts like conditionality or plan-inclusive counterplans or things like that. You're just going to be explaining in your own words a rule or norm for debate that is good. So in the case of theory, the interp is more like a written rule of debate. The next part of the shell is the violation, basically where you spell out what your opponent did that broke the debate rule or did not meet the definition of a T-shell. Then the next part is standards. This is the bulk of the shell. You can think of this kind of as like the link part of the shell, where you basically explain why violating this rule, why breaking this definition is a bad thing, or how it leads to bad things. So a common example would be something like ground. So if your opponent violates a T-shell, if they are reading something that is not topical, then that means that you, as the negative debater, do not have any ground. You don't have pre-written or possible disad, counterplan, K strategies that link to the AF, because the AF isn't what you were prepared for, which means that the violating the interp leads to decreased fairness. So that's kind of like the link part of debate, and then link part of this shell. And then the voters are like the impacts, where you explain why fairness and education matter. Most of the time when we're talking about standards, what the ultimate conclusion of standards is that somehow the person that the shell is being read against, they led to a less fair or less educational debate. So then in the voters, you tell us why fairness and education matters. That's the impact part. So you can think about how, like in a disad, if the disad leads to nuclear war, you have a card in there that just says nuclear war bad. So here you're just saying fairness good, education good. It doesn't necessarily need to be grounded in the standards. A lot of times voters are pre-written, and you'll hear them kind of repeated, the same arguments. Now, in that last section of the shell, in the voters section, there's a whole other type of argument called paradigm issues. Paradigm issues are a really important concept, and if that term doesn't sound familiar to you, I recommend that you watch the Intro to T Theory video that is uploaded on this channel, where I go in depth about paradigm issues a little bit more so than I will here. That being said, we are going to start with a quick review of paradigm issues, because paradigm issues frame a lot of concepts that are important with how we respond to a shell. So the first paradigm issue that we'll talk about is drop the debater versus drop the argument. So remember, this is the paradigm issue that answers the question, what happens if you prove that the shell is true? What happens if you prove that your opponent broke a rule or didn't follow the topic? So the two different answers to this question, the two possible answers, are drop the debater, which means that the opponent loses. We drop the debater for violating the rule. Or drop the argument, which means that the judge should just ignore the parts of the case that were bad, should just ignore the arguments that didn't follow the rule of debate. So if you are the person reading the shell, you're more likely to say drop the debater because you want to win the round. But if you are having a shell read against you, you're more likely to say drop the argument because you want to be able to still win the round regardless of the fact that your opponent might win that the case, even if your opponent wins that the shell is true, that doesn't mean that you lose the round because you can just go for different arguments. So the way that this paradigm issue frames our response is it basically tells us how important it is to answer this shell thoroughly. 99% of the time, you're going to have somebody read drop the debater. I've only seen maybe once in 6 years of involvement in debate, I've only seen maybe once somebody read a shell that had dropped the argument in it, and that was because of an accident. They did it on, didn't mean to do that. So 99% of the time, the implication is drop the debater, and that's why a lot of times we say that if there's theory debate happening, that it should be one of the first things you address in your speech, because it is a win-lose issue. So if your opponent reads drop the debater, that's the signal to you that you should respond to T-theory really early on in your speech. Probably even the very first thing out of your mouth should be about the theory shell. The next paradigm issue that we'll talk about is no RBIs versus RBIs. Basically, this is asking the question, is it possible for your opponent to win if they prove that the shell is false? If they prove that there was no abuse, does that mean that they win the round? So RVI is an acronym for reverse voting issue. That just makes sense because if the shell is a voting issue, then if it goes the other way and you can lose for reading a shell that isn't true, then that means that we've reversed that voting issue. So one of the answers to this question is no RBIs. There's no way that you can win the round, even if you don't win the round for proving that the shell is false. The judge has to look at other arguments. So if my opponent wins that they were not abusive, that doesn't mean they win. It just means that now you get to look to the case itself, the content of the case, and evaluate the debate there. Whereas yes RBIs, the other side of this debate, says that if your opponent proves that it's not abusive, that they are not violating any rule, or that they are topical, then that means that they win the round. So obviously, if you're reading a shell, you're going to say no RBIs because you don't want your opponent to have an easy route to the ballot. But if you are answering the shell, you're going to say RBIs because you want to have the ability to win on T in theory, so that way the time investment that you're putting in there can equate to a victory, right? So this is another paradigm issue that basically tells us how important it is, how much time we need to spend answering this shell. Basically, what it boils down to is that if you think that you can win yes RBIs, then it's worth spending more time on the shell because you have the possibility of winning. But if you really don't think you can win RBIs, if you think that no RBIs, like your opponent read, 8 justifications for no RBIs, and you don't think you're going to be able to win that debate, then we want to be careful about not spending too much time on that shell because we are ultimately investing time in something that can't get us a ballot. So RBIs versus no RBIs kind of helps us decide how much time we should spend answering the shell. So, for instance, it's not uncommon for really skilled tier theory debaters to just spend all 4 minutes of a 1AR answering a shell and going for RBIs because they know that that's a way that they can have a really easy direct route to the ballot. That being said, that's a strategy that you probably shouldn't go for until you're really comfortable with the T-theory debate. So the last paradigm issue, and the one that is kind of most important for framing our response, is competing interps versus reasonability. This is fundamentally a question of how is our response structured. So obviously we can understand why that's important for the purposes of answering T in theory. So the two sides of this debate are competing interps, which basically says that in order to win or respond effectively to a theory shell or a T shell, you need to read a counter interp. You need to read another rule or another definition and prove why that is better. Whereas reasonability just says that we can line by line the shell. We can just say, actually, we weren't abusive. My opponent's shell isn't very good. They're lacking warrants, things of that nature. And that is sufficient to win the shell. So if you are reading to your theory, you're going to say competing interps is true because that is putting more of a burden on your opponent. It's making responding harder. Whereas if you are answering a shell, you're going to want to go for reasonability because then that means that you don't need to invest as much time in a counter interp. Now, the reason that I talk about this in relative terms of investing time as opposed to just not reading a counter interp is that it's always important that we do elements of both of these strategies. Unless your opponent reads reasonability in their shell, which they 99% of the time won't do, you should always read a counter interp, even if you plan on going for reasonability over competing interps, just because it's better to cover yourself in the case that they do wind up winning that paradigm issue. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what each of these strategies looks like, and then at the end we'll kind of finish up this lecture with how to put these elements together. So if we're going the competing interps route, then what we need to write is a counter shell. We need to come up with that alternative rule or that alternative definition and justify why that's good. And so the structure of this is very similar to just the structure of an actual shell. So notable difference one is that instead of an interpretation, we have a counter interpretation, because it's saying that this is something this is how we should view this issue as opposed to how my opponent is viewing it. In the case of a T shell, when you're answering a T shell, the counter interpretation is another definition. Most often, it's going to be the same word that your opponent defined. You're just going to define it in a different way based on a different source, or maybe like a second definition that is available through the same dictionary. And that's because if you want your shell to be competitive, it needs to be talking about the same thing that your opponent is talking about. So if your opponent gets up and reads T about the word countries, you don't want to get up and read T about the word arsenals, because obviously those are two different issues. So what you want to do is read a counter shell that talks about the same word or the same group of words or term of art that we have in the original T shell. Now, if we're answering theory, our counter interpretation is just an alternate debate rule. And again, we want to make sure that this is very similar to my opponent's rule, or that it pertains to the same aspect of debate as my opponent's rule. So for instance, if my opponent says that the neg may not read a conditional advocacy, my counter-interp might be that the neg cannot read more than one conditional advocacy. So obviously we're talking about a similar concept. We're talking about something that pertains to the same issues of fairness in education and how we access those voters, but I'm saying that I'm changing my interp sufficiently enough to where I'm no longer violating it. And that's a really important concept for counterinterpretations, is that we want to make sure that when we're writing a counterinterpretation, we are writing an interp that our case meets. Because the worst case scenario, a really bad mistake to make, is to read a counterinterp that you don't meet, because then you're just saying, wouldn't it have been better if I did this? And your opponent will just say, yes, they are correct, which further proves that what you did was not great. So it's really important that we meet our counterinterps. The other note I have here is planks. We can add planks to an interp and make that our counter-interp. So for instance, if the neg theory shell says that the affirmative debater may not specify a country, the common counter-interp that you might hear in the 1AR is that the affirmative debater may specify a country if they disclose on the wiki. So we reverse the interp, we say that we can do that, and then we add a qualifier, and that qualifier is called a plank. So like a disclosure plank is a common way to modify an interp, and then our standards will reflect why disclosing resolves the types of impacts that the original shell talks about. So now let's talk about the standards on a counter shell. Well, first I'll note that there aren't violations on a counter shell because you are arguing something that you meet, right? There's, in theory, no violation here because everybody's following these rules and you're saying that that's a good thing. So there's no violation, so we go straight to standards. So these standards are very similar to what you might see in a normal shell where you'll say, you know, ground, and then you'll give an explanation of how you preserve ground or your rule preserves ground, and then connect it to fairness or education. Something that you see come up a lot in counter shells are what we call flex standards, so like af flex or neg flex, which basically is just saying that it's important that the af or neg respectively have some flexibility in how they can approach the debate, because that allows for better clash and that allows for a more fair debate. So basically this is saying that it's okay if we do something that's a little bit outside of the rules, because it's important that we have flexibility. And that's an articulation for a lot of counter interps. It's more common to see a standard like that. Another thing that's kind of common in counter shells is to have specific type of educations as a standard. So the types that you hear a lot of real world education, policy education, philosophy education, things of that nature. So what we basically say here is that, you know, if you're saying that, if your opponent is saying that you can't specify a country, or basically is reading a shell that says that you can't really read a plan af, then you're going to say one of your standards is policy education. Policy education is uniquely good, which means that even if it's not necessarily fair to read a plan af, it's worth our time to do it because the education that we get from it is better. Now, obviously, if you're reading a type of education standard, you want to go for education is a more important voter than fairness. But that is a pretty solid strategy that a lot of people go for with counter shells. And the last note I have for the standards is that we can keep in mind independent voters. I list these in another slide. The independent voters that we hear most often are accessibility, resolvability, and then debatability, and that's kind of in decreasing order. So an independent voter is basically where you can say in the standards that your opponent's shell is uniquely bad or your counter-interp is uniquely good, better said, in one of those three realms, and those three realms are so important that the judge can vote off of those alone without looking at the other standards, without looking at fairness and education. So accessibility, if you can prove that your rule is better for small schools or for underprivileged debaters or something like that, then you can convince the judge to vote off of that because accessibility is a uniquely important issue. Resolvability, if you can prove that your rule is better for the judge to be able to make a decision at the end of the round, then the judge should probably vote off of that, because if the debate is irresolvable, then the judge's job is moot, so it's important that they defend resolvability when they can. And then debatability is basically just saying that we need to have discussions that are centered around a contestable point. We can't have debates that are just both sides protesting facts, because then there's no point in having a debate. There's no education that can be derived. So those are independent voters. And if you can find a way to work those into the standards, those are always really helpful. And then the last thing for a counter shell is voters. So if your opponent goes for fairness or education or both, and you think that your standards link to those things the strongest, you can just say cross-apply voters off of my opponent's shell. But let's say that your opponent went all in for fairness and your standards are about education, then you're going to want to read an education voter. So voters on a counter shell are really, really dependent on the context of the round. Another thing that you want to do here is that if, for instance, you went for a type of education standard, you want to do your weighing between education and fairness here as well. So you can say cross-apply the education voter off of my opponent's shell, and education comes before fairness for 3 reasons. So that way you're kind of getting ahead of the weighing debate that can happen on the voters. So that's kind of the details of what a counter shell looks like. That's the counter-interp's method of approaching answering tier theory. So now let's talk about the reasonability side. So I think it's helpful for people to think of reasonability as line by lining a shell. So it's basically just going through and explaining why the individual arguments that your opponent makes are flawed, just like we would for a standard case. There is a specialized type of argument that falls under the realm of reasonability that is a really, really important argument to make. It's on par with the perm on a counter advocacy, a CP or a K, in the sense that every time you're answering tier theory, you're going to try to make an I-meet. I-meets are super, super important arguments. They're super, super helpful, and it's absolutely essential that you make these arguments every time you get the opportunity. In essence, an I-meet is saying why you don't violate the interp, why you are following the rule that they describe, or why your case is operating under the definition that they provided for that word. Now, the reason why this is such a good argument, obviously, is that if you never broke a rule, if you never weren't topical, then there's no reason to look to the shell at all. So an I-meet, well performed, and if you win reasonability, is a good way of having the debate, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But basically, if you win reasonability and you win an I-meet, then the T-shell is over. The theory shell is over. An I-meet is like the silver bullet that can take out a shell. An important piece of information, or another important dimension to consider with I-meets, is that there's kind of 2 ways that we can approach making an I-meet, and 2 ways that we can approach interpreting, understanding and interpretation in general. And that is spirit versus text of the interp. So let's say that your opponent says that the negative debater may not read multiple conditional advocacies. And then all of their standards are basically talking about how if my opponent gets up and reads some crazy number of conditional advocacies, like 10 conditional advocacies, that's a bad thing. Well, the 2 ways of approaching that are to say that the interpretation, the spirit of the interpretation, is that the negative debater may not read a lot of conditional advocacies, whereas the text just says multiple. So if we're making an I-meet on the spirit of the interp, we're going to say we meet because we don't read a ridiculous amount of conditional advocacies. We only read 2, and all of their abuse stories, all of their standards, all of their weighing is premised off the idea that I'm reading a crazy amount of conditional advocacies when really I'm only reading 2. And that's not going to trigger any of the abuse scenarios that they talk about. Versus an I meet to the text of the interp would be you'd have to prove that you are not reading multiple at all. You are not reading more than one conditional advocacy. So obviously a text of the interp I meet is probably going to be better because that is going to be easier to prove that you're actually following the rule if you follow the rule to the letter. But if your opponent has a really significant disjoint between the way that the interp is worded and the way that the standards garner offense, then a spirit of the interp I meet is still a viable option. So then once we make I meets should be the first kind of thing you do when you're line by lining the shell because it pertains to the interp. It's at the very top, right? So once we make our I meets, we want to answer some standards, right? We want to go through my opponent's shell and explain why their standards are bad. We can think about this like answering a contention, where basically there's a bunch of links that are happening here where you say, my opponent did this, this leads to a decrease in ground, and that leads to a decrease in fairness. It's basically just debate syllogism. So if we can pick apart any individual claim, any individual warrant, any individual connection or link in the standards, then we are therefore disproving that that standard is true. So just like with a contention, we want to make sure that we answer each individual. With an app case, we want to answer every contention. With a shell, we want to answer every standard, at least with one link takeout or something like that. Another way that we can go about answering standards, and this is something that is useful especially if we have a counter interp, is controlling the internal link. So internal link control is when you say, for instance, that one standard necessarily controls another. So for instance, if your opponent read strat skew, and then in your counter shell you mentioned ground, you can say that ground is an internal link to strat skew because we can't have any multiple strategies at all if we don't have ground to begin with, which means that any impacts that come from strat skew come from ground, but more so. So if you are doing that, that's basically a way of outweighing or making your standard come before anything that your opponent's standards do if you can win an internal link claim. So that's a really strong form of reasonability there. Another important concept to kind of highlight when we're answering standards is that there's a distinction to be made about why theory was read in the first place. So theory can either function in a norm-setting way, saying that this is a debate rule and I'm reading this in the round in the hopes that this will become a norm, that this will normalize this behavior and make debate more like this, versus an abuse check, which is saying I read this shell because what you did was really not fair to me and I don't think I can win this round without calling you out on being unfair. So norm setting is more like a universal change, and abuse check is more like in the context of this round, the shell was important. So when we're answering standards, what we really want to do is hone in on or kind of consider this from multiple angles, because if we are going through reasonability and we're saying that we did not limit ground, we did not induce strat skew, we did not lead to time skew, what we are basically saying is that there was no abuse, which means there's no need for an abuse check. However, that still leaves the door open to our opponent to make norm-setting claims, even though they're much weaker if there's no abuse story. But we still want to make sure that when we're giving our reasonability explanations, that we hit on the fact that norm-setting is false, or that norm setting is not necessary, or that their rule is independently bad, which means that setting it as a norm would be a bad thing. So make sure that when we are answering standards, that we are answering them from both an abuse check standpoint and also saying that a norm setting goal is a flawed one as well, because that is a kind of pivot that a lot of skilled T-theory debaters will make to get out of a standard that they that has been proven to be non-abusive. And then the last thing here is that just like with a counter shell, we can work independent voters into answering standards. So for instance, if your opponent reads a standard that kind of frames debate or says that debate should move in a direction that is worse for small school debaters or something like that, you can say this standard reflects accessibility concerns and they're moving in the wrong direction, which means that this is an independent reason to drop them. So make sure that you can embed stuff like that in your shell, in your response to the shell whenever you can, because that is a big secret to strategic responses and effective responses in winning T-theory debates, is having independent voters and things like that, little tricks seeded throughout our response. So the last kind of thing to consider for responding to a shell, so obviously competing interps and reasonability are more about the content dimension of the shell, the specifics of the interp, but we can also go for paradigm issues in a more general sense. We can frame how this debate is had differently. So we want to choose carefully when we're deciding which paradigm issues to go for, and to go for paradigm issues at all. You're probably not, you're not often going to have to go for paradigm issues, but it is always an extra strategic benefit. And I can say that you will probably never go for every paradigm issue, because that is a huge time investment that is most likely not going to pay off. So when I say going for paradigm issues, I mean that what you're going to try to do is reverse the claim that was made by your opponent in regards to one of the paradigm issues. So for instance, if your opponent read competing interps, which they most likely did, you're going to try to prove that reasonability is better. If your opponent said you don't get RBIs, you're going to try to say that you do get RBIs. If your opponent says that they should drop the debater for abuse, you're going to say drop the argument for abuse. And so I put those in numbered order because those are kind of the order of the priority of those things. If you have time to go for paradigm issues, you should probably go for reasonability first, then RBIs, then drop the argument. This is not a hard and fast rule, but I can explain my logic behind advising people this way. So I think reasonability in competing interps is probably the first paradigm issue to go for, because it controls whether or not you are winning the T-theory debate. So if you win RBIs or something like that, if you win that you win the round, if you win the shell, but you didn't win the paradigm issue that enables you to win the shell most effectively, then the RBIs are kind of useless. So winning reasonability makes it much easier to gain access to things like RBIs. And then RBIs are useful to go to because they give you another route to the ballot, and that's always worth doing. And then drop the arg. You will probably never go for drop the arg, because a lot of times it just doesn't make sense in the context of the round. Like for instance, T-shell, it doesn't make any sense to drop the arg because you're saying that the violation, the argument that is bad is the AF, which means that dropping the arg is the same as dropping the debater. So a lot of times drop the arg is just nonsensical, and it doesn't give you that much of a strategic benefit. So when we're going for paradigm issues, that's kind of the order of priority. And when we make the decision to go for paradigm issues, it's really important that we stay comparative. Way too often in theory debates, I see people just get up and they say that they're going to go for reasonability, and then they just say reasonability is good for 3 reasons and move on. That puts me as a judge in a really, really hard spot, because I understand that reasonability is good, but your opponent already told me that competing interps is good, and you never told me why they were wrong about that, so I'm just here thinking, like, oh, both of these are good options, but you have not told me which one is preferable, which means that you've then given your opponent the opportunity to dominate that paradigm issues debate. So you want to explain why your side is better than the opponents, not just that your side is good. Why reasonability is better than competing interps, as opposed to reasonability is good and leaving competing interp justifications there. It's also a good idea to answer your opponent's justifications. So you're going to say that prefer reasonability over competing interps, and you're going to give your justifications, but then you're also going to take the time to say, on my opponent's competing interps justification, their logic is flawed here because blah, blah, blah. And you're going to explain why their justifications are bad, like line by lining them. And you can also do weighing as a way of doing comparison between your justification and your opponent's justification. So for instance, if you justify that reasonability is better for accessibility and your opponent is just saying that competing interps is better for education, you can say accessibility before education means that reasonability being good comes before competing interps being good. So that's just a couple of concerns for going for paradigm issues. So now that we kind of understand these individual skills, let's talk a little bit about how we can put them together and structure a whole response. So your opponent reads a shell. What actually does your speech look like? Well, the portion of your speech that is spent answering the shell should go roughly in this order. First, you're going to read your counter shell. So you're going to come right out the gate and you're going to say, first counter interp, and then read that whole shell. And then you're going to move over to your opponent's shell and start doing your reasonability stuff. You're going to start with I meets, because It's pertaining to the interrupt and violation, which is at the top of the flow. And then you're going to go down the flow, you're going to answer your standards. And then at the very bottom of the flow, you have your paradigm issues. You're going to go for them, but only if you have time. Like I said, paradigm issues are not an essential because from a purely like factual perspective, we can play the answering theory game from the paradigm issues that your opponent reads. It's just going to be a little bit harder. So not going for paradigm issues isn't a death sentence. It just means that you might have a little bit of a more uphill battle in later speeches. So this is a really easy to flow logical organization that kind of prioritizes the most important stuff while also going in the order of the flow. This is a really nifty order that I think I find the easiest to flow and the easiest to do as a debater. But as you get more experience and you get more comfortable with answering T in theory, this order can change a little bit. So for instance, if you know that you've gotten a lot better with time allocation, because T in theory is an easy place to get your time allocation messed up, but if you know that you're good with time allocation there, maybe you want to go for RBIs as soon as you get to the shell. So you're going to read your counter shell and then do your paradigm issue stuff and then do I-meets and standards. But like I said, that's really only for if you're really comfortable with your technical skills on the T-theory flow. When you're starting out, I strongly suggest sticking to this order because we're putting the non-essential things like going for paradigm issues at the bottom so that if you look at your timer and you say, wow, I've spent way too much time here, you can move on without putting yourself in a tough situation. So just some final notes on answering T in theory, just final tips that are important to consider. Make sure that you always ask for layering from your opponent. So if your opponent reads a T or theory shell, they are basically criticizing you on a layer that is higher than the content layer. They are saying that before the judge looks at whether or not the resolution is true, they need to look at this T theory issue. But you should always just clarify with them that they are reading T in theory as a higher layer. So you'll ask your opponent what comes first in the round, T in theory or whatever the other flows in the round is. It could be, does T come before K? Does T come before case? The answer to that will always be yes, but the T and K issue is sometimes a little bit more of a gray area. But it's always important to ask just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and your opponent can't do something tricky about layering in later speeches. Also, it's always important that when we are formulating our responses, reasonability responses and things like that as well, we are paying attention to two things. First, the voters and their relative weight. In other words, what voters were read and what voter was articulated as the most important voter, because if we get up and we give like a really good counter shell that talks about education impacts and we sit down and we're like, wow, that was an incredible speech, and then we look at our opponent's shell and we realize that they only read a fairness voter and we forgot to read an education voter, or that they said fairness over education and we conceded that, then we've just wasted our time, right? So it's really important that we read the voter section thoroughly and understand any tricks that are happening there. Also make sure that we are considering paradigm issues. So for instance, if your opponent went for no RBIs and you spend 3 minutes of the 1AR on the shell and you never go for RBIs, then you've just spent 3 minutes on a flow that you can't win. So make sure that you pay attention to the paradigm issues and the way that those frame our approach. Otherwise, you're going to wind up making some strategic decisions that are going to be less than beneficial. And the last kind of advice I have is look out for generic answers or pre-written answer files to certain T or theory shells. T in theory is constantly evolving. The warrants for individual standards and what standards are included under different interps change all the time. So if you're somebody who is from a school that has maybe previous files and stuff like that for previous seasons, what they read as an answer to a certain T theory argument, or maybe you get something from the wiki or circuit debater or something older like that, you can use it as kind of an example, but I would strongly urge you not to read that in round because you're going to miss out on some of the nuances of your opponent's individual unique shell. So you should always you should only read a pre-written response if it was written to that person and their shell, because everybody will write a shell a little bit differently. And the last thing I'll say kind of on this front is, in general, if the point of debate is to get if the point of doing debate is to get better and learn and stuff like that, then staying away from pre-written answer files altogether is probably the better option, because answering T in theory makes you better at speaking on your feet, extemping T in theory, and kind of doing that more nuanced analysis in a quick way, and that skill will help you in the other aspects of debate. So answering T in theory makes you better at reading T in theory. If you're always reading out of a file, if you're always reading pre-written stuff from another teammate, then you're not going to be gaining or developing the skills that you could be. So that's kind of the last thing I want to say here. I know that this was probably a lot of info, and like I said, there's another 300 hours of information that could be said on this topic, but we will stop here. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good rest of your day.